You've always wondered how medieval peasants coped with war, famine, and harsh winters. So now you step into their shoes and feel every empty ache, every cold breath, every dull fear as your own. This is how you find the answers, not by watching from afar, but by waking up in that life and staying there until the questions become slow, heavy, and no longer need words. You wake before the sun because the cold wakes you first. A thin, hard cold that presses against your eyelids and creeps under the rough wool of your blanket, if you can call it a blanket, when it is little more than patched cloth and old scraps of fur sewn together in crooked lines. And you lie there for a moment, very still, with your eyes closed, listening to the familiar sounds of your own breathing and the faint rasp of someone turning over in the straw beside you. Your stomach is already aware that it is morning, already aware that it will not receive enough. The dull, hollow ache settled there like an old neighbor who never leaves. And you know that soon you will have to get up. You will have to step into the cold air that hangs above the floor like a second, thinner world, and the day will start again almost exactly as yesterday did. You open your eyes to the dim brown interior of the hut. The same low roof of dark beams overhead, the same smoke stains spreading like shadows along the rafters, the same threads of light creeping through the cracks where the wooden walls no longer fit as tightly as they once did. And you can see your own breath as a pale cloud when you exhale, fading almost as soon as it appears. The smell is the same mixture you know so well that you hardly smell it anymore. Dried earth, old smoke, damp wool, the faint sourness of sweat and unwashed bodies. And somewhere beneath it all, the distant scent of ashes and old soup that seems to have soaked into the walls themselves. Around you, the shapes of your family are only lumps under blankets at first, then slowly become clearer as your eyes adjust. The rise and fall of a chest, the stray lock of hair on a forehead, a hand uncovering itself from the covers for a moment before retreating from the cold. You push the covers back, and the first touch of air on your skin makes your muscles tighten without you wanting them to. Your body reacting faster than thought, and you swing your feet to the ground where the earth-packed floor is cold and faintly uneven under your calloused soles. The cold reaches into your bones. But you know that if you keep moving, it will become something you can ignore, just another weight that you carry. So you move, slowly but steadily, pulling on your rough woolen tunic, tugging it down over your hips, wrapping yourself in the same thick, slightly greasy cloak that you wore yesterday, and the day before that, and the winter before this one, too. Your fingers are numb for the first few moments, so the familiar knots and ties are clumsy. But you have done this so many times that your hands know what to do, even when they struggle to feel. The hearth is no more than a faint glow, a cluster of tired embers curled into themselves beneath a shell of gray ash. And you kneel in front of them, reaching out with slow movements so the brittle coals are not scattered, and you coax them back to life. You add a thin twist of straw, then a small bundle of kindling, and you blow carefully until a first thin tongue of flame appears, then hesitates, then reluctantly clings to the edge of a splintered branch. The smoke curls up and disappears into the dimness above, finding its way out of the hole set in the roof, and a faint extra warmth begins to seep into the air around you. Not enough to make you comfortable, just enough to draw the cold back a little. Behind you there is a small sound as one of the children shifts, then another as someone coughs softly into the straw. And you are aware of their presence as you always are, like points on a map you carry inside your head. This one is smaller and coughs more often. That one is older and eats a little more. The third talks in his sleep sometimes when the night is very cold. And all of them depend on what this house can provide, what your hands and the thin soil outside can pull from the world. You know them without looking. And yet when you do turn your head, when you see the narrow faces and the thin wrists, and the way their blankets fall in sharp lines instead of soft curves, it presses on your chest for a moment. Not as surprise, because there is no surprise left in you where hunger is concerned, but as a slow tightening that you have come to accept as part of yourself. You reach for the small sack of grain near the hearth almost without thinking and almost without hope, because you already know how light it felt yesterday, how much you poured into the pot then, how little is left now. But you still open it and look inside, because you have to see. The grains are few and scattered at the bottom like pale seeds of something that will not have time to grow. And for a moment your hand rests there, fingers dipping into them, feeling their hardness and the way they slide against your skin. And you measure them not in handfuls, but in mornings, in how many more days you can stretch them, in how thin you can make the porridge before it stops being food at all. You pour only a little into the pot, less than your body wants you to, less than the hollow in your stomach begs for. And you make yourself think of the days ahead instead of the day in front of you, of the way the wind has been blowing colder each sunrise, of the thin edge of frost you saw on the edge of the bucket yesterday, of the stories you heard last week about a village not far away whose stores were already gone. You add water from the bucket, a liquid, cloudy but clean enough, and you stir slowly as the pot warms above the rekindled fire, the wooden spoon moving in a patient circle, scraping gently along the bottom because this pot is too precious to scratch, because this pot has carried every thin meal your family has eaten for years. The smell that rises is faint, hardly a smell at all, more like a ghost of food than food itself. And yet it is enough to wake everyone fully, enough to make heads lift and eyes open, enough to draw small bodies toward the fire in hunched shapes, blankets around shoulders, hair tangled with straw. You do not speak. They do not speak. Because there is nothing new to say about the morning, and words use energy that might be better saved. And the silence between you is not empty. It is full of the same knowledge you all share. You ladle the porridge into wooden bowls, careful to make each portion look as if it is the same, careful to give the children their share first, careful not to look too long at the bottom of the pot when the last drops are scraped out. When you finally sit and bring the bowl to your lips, the heat touches your face before it reaches your mouth, and you take the first sip slowly, letting it rest on your tongue for a moment, as if it were something rich, as if it were something rare, letting your senses pretend that there is more here than a few grains and water. And in that short moment, you give yourself the illusion that you are not counting, that you are not measuring every mouthful against days yet to come. The porridge is thin, the grains soft but few, and you feel more of the warmth than the substance. Yet you drink until the bowl is empty, until there is nothing left but a faint ring of paste along the inside that you wipe with your finger and place carefully in your mouth, because nothing is too small to matter. Your day begins officially when the bowl is empty, because once the taste of the first and only meal fades, all that remains is work. And work is what stands between your family and the deeper version of hunger that you try not to think about. You stand, stretching your back, feeling the dull ache in your shoulders and knees as something familiar and almost comforting, because as long as you ache, you are still moving, still doing what you must. You take your cloak, your worn boots, your simple cap, and you step out of the hut into the crisp morning air that cuts at your cheeks and fills your lungs with a kind of clean cold that is almost pleasant at first, before it sinks further in. The village is waking with you. And yet it never feels as if it truly sleeps, because even at night there is always a dog barking somewhere, always someone coughing, always the creak of a door, always the low murmur of voices through thin walls. Now, though, the sounds gather and rise, the scrape of a latch, the thud of a foot on frozen ground, the distant bleating of a sheep, and the faint metallic clang of something in the blacksmith's corner of the settlement. The huts stand close together, their thatched roofs dark with damp, angles softened by moss and time. Thin threads of smoke curling upward into the pale sky where the sun is still nothing more than a suggestion behind a veil of clouds. You walk the short path toward the fields, your feet following a route so familiar that you no longer think of it as a route at all, more as a line your body knows by memory. And you pass the same faces you pass every morning, A neighbor nods to you, eyes hollowed in the same way yours are, cheekbones sharp beneath thinning skin. And you nod back. A quiet exchange that carries everything it needs to carry without words. You notice the half-empty woodpile against his wall, how low it has already grown. You notice the patch where his roof sags slightly, the way he glances up at the clouds as if he could see the coming snow in their color. Near the edge of the village stands the low stone church, its simple bell tower pointing a blunt finger toward the sky. And you see the priest moving slowly outside, his robe gathered against the wind, his hands already folded in front of him as if in permanent prayer. You know that later, when the work is done or when the sky darkens early, you will probably step inside those stone walls for a few moments. Not because you expect miracles, but because the echo of your footsteps on the cold floor and the smell of candle wax and incense create a small space inside you where the noise of hunger and fear is quieter. For now, you pass by, feeling the weight of the building behind you like a larger, heavier presence that belongs as much to your world as the fields do. The land beyond the village stretches out in slow lines and dull colors, brown and gray, and the faint, tired green of plants that cling to life as the cold gathers strength. The fields that you and the others work are not generous. They are stubborn, and they give only what you can coax from them with long hours and tired muscles and patience. You remember the last harvest, how the grain lay thin and patchy across the ground, how the sickles flashed in the weak sunlight, how everyone worked harder and longer because they could see with their own eyes that it would not be enough, and yet they could not stop. The memory of that season sits behind your eyes as you walk, an image you cannot shake. The sight of bags that should have been full and heavy, instead sagging only halfway. Today there is still work to do in the fields, even if the harvest is gone. Because the land does not care that you are hungry, it needs to be prepared, to be mended, to be turned, so that when spring finally pushes the frost away, you will not lose time. You take up your tool, the handle worn smooth by your own hands and those who held it before you. And you begin the slow, repetitive labor of clearing, repairing, digging. The ground is stiff and unyielding, the earth clumped and hard, and each motion takes more strength than the last. Yet there is a rhythm to it, a pattern that steadies your mind. And in that rhythm your thoughts slow, your worries blur into a kind of background murmur. As you work, you feel hunger differently than you did before breakfast. It is no longer a sharp note, but a constant hum, a low vibration inside your body that reminds you of its presence without screaming for your attention. You have known this feeling for so long that living without it seems like a strange idea, something that belongs to stories about saints or distant lords who have tables full of food. For you, hunger is not an event, not an emergency. It is the ground note of your days, and learning to live with it, to work with it, to carry it into the fields and back again, is one of the first lessons you have ever learned. There are moments when the wind rises, sliding over the open land and through your clothes as if they were hardly there at all. And those moments remind you of the winter that is coming, the deeper cold that has not yet arrived but already shapes your actions. You think of the wood stacked behind the house, the logs splitting under your axe, the way your hands sting when you miss and the handle jars your palms. You think of the roof you checked for leaks, the straw you pushed tighter into the gaps between the wall planks, the extra attention you gave to the place near the hearth where the draft always sneaks in. You move through these preparations as you move through your work in the fields, slowly, steadily, not expecting that it will make everything right, only that it will make things slightly less hard. From time to time, you straighten your back and look up from your work, and your eyes travel across the fields to the distant manor, the Lord's house, set on a slight rise as if it needed to be above the land as well as above the people who work it. The building is larger, sturdier, perhaps warmer, its roof better kept, its walls thicker. And the fields around it are also fields, also earth, also grain. But the grain that grows there will never pass through your hands except as rent, as tax, as something that belongs to someone else. You know this as you watch the place for a few moments. And yet the knowledge does not sharpen into anger, because anger takes energy and promises change. And in your world, change rarely comes for people like you. Instead, the Lord's house occupies a space in your mind like a piece of weathered rock, solid, unmovable, something that has always been there and will always be there. By midday, or what you call midday, though you do not carry any clock but the sky and the ache in your body, you stop for a short rest. There is no second meal, only a brief pause to lean on your tool, to stretch your hands, to roll your shoulders one way then the other, to feel your muscles ease for a few breaths before they tighten again. You look toward the nearby figures of other peasants, see them doing the same, their faces turned to the same pale sun that hides behind the thin clouds, as if there might be a little warmth there to catch. You share a few quiet comments, nothing important, nothing bright, just enough to remind each other that you are not alone in this field, in this season, in this kind of life. The hours that follow blend into each other, the repetition softening the edges of time so that you begin to count not in minutes or tasks, but in how tired your arms feel, how numb your fingers have become, how many times your breath emerges in a cloud before your face. You fall into a kind of slow, walking dream, where the details of the world become smaller and sharper. The roughness of the wooden handle against your palm, the sound of the blade biting into frozen earth, the faint squelch where the soil is still wet beneath the thin crust. In this state, the larger worries, the words hunger and war and winter, recede to the horizon of your mind. Still there, still real, but not pressing at the front of your thoughts. As the light begins to fade and the sky shifts gently toward a duller, deeper gray, you know it is time to return. The path back to the village is the same as the path out, yet it feels different when your body is heavier, when every step leaves a deeper mark in the ground. You walk with others, boots scuffing against the same patches of frozen mud. And you listen as someone mentions a rumor heard from a traveler about soldiers on the move far to the south, about some quarrel between men who wear crowns that will translate into more taxes, more demands, more fear. The words pass between you without causing more than a slight tightening in your gut, because this too is something you have learned to live with. The distant rumble of threats that may or may not arrive, like thunder behind the hills. When you reach your hut, the sight of it brings a small, soft relief. Not because it is safe in any grand sense, but because it is yours, or as much yours as anything can be in this world. A place where you know every corner, every shadow, every creak. You push open the door, step back into the familiar dimness, and let the closer warmth of the hearth wrap itself around you. The modest heat that feels stronger after the open air of the fields. Inside, the others are settling into evening, such as it is. There is mending to be done, a tool to be examined, a child's cough to be listened to, a lump of wood to be whittled into something more useful. There is no true supper waiting, only the possibility of warming what remains of the morning's porridge, scraping every bit from the pot so that the youngest can have one more taste. And you stand by the fire again, stirring, feeling the texture of the thin mixture with your spoon and with your eyes, seeing clearly how little there is. You have already decided that you will not eat this time. Or perhaps you decided long before, but only now turn the thought into action. And you make sure that your face does not show that decision, because you do not want anyone to argue with you. You do not want to see concern appear in their eyes, where there is already enough of it. Evening draws itself around the hut, slowly. The light outside dimming until the only brightness comes from the fire and the small, ragged candle that you save for tasks that must be done with more care. The air grows colder again, pressing against the walls, pushing its fingers under the door. But inside you have layers of cloth and wool and shared breath, and these things create a bubble of warmth that is not comfortable but is bearable. You sit near the hearth with your hands extended to the flames, feeling the sting as your fingers thaw. And you listen to the small sounds in the room, a quiet conversation, the soft scrape of needle against cloth, the crackle of burning wood. Your thoughts wander in this half-light, and you let them, because this is one of the few times of the day when you can afford to let them go where they want, without losing your grip on the work in front of you. You think of previous winters, of times when the snow seemed to stack itself higher than the walls of the hut, when the door had to be pushed open with your shoulder, when the world beyond the village disappeared into a white silence. You remember years when the grain stores lasted longer and years when they vanished too quickly. And you realize that your memory of these things is not organized by dates or numbers. It is arranged instead by how your body felt, by how deep the cold reached, by how loud your stomach growled, by how many times you lay awake at night listening for sounds that meant danger. Tonight, as on so many nights, you lie down in your place on the straw, sharing what warmth you can with the bodies beside you, and you listen for those sounds again. You listen for the wind first, gauging its strength by the way it rattles the loose board near the roof and whistles past the hole where the smoke escapes. You listen for the distant barking of dogs, the heavy crunch of footsteps outside, the jingle of metal that might mean travelers or soldiers or nothing at all. You listen to the shallow breathing of the children, the occasional small snore, the wet edge of a cough. And you count these sounds as if they were beads, one by one, until you feel your own breath falling into the same slow rhythm. The hunger in you is quiet, but not gone, like a coal buried in ash, still warm enough to be felt if you reach for it. And you choose not to reach for it, because thinking of it will not make it smaller. The worries about war and winter, and the thin sack of grain by the hearth form a kind of fog around the edges of your mind. But in the center, there is something else. A simple fact that holds you in place. That you have made it through this day. That you can try again tomorrow. That this is how people like you cope. Not with sudden gestures or bold acts, but with small, repeated actions that look almost like nothing when you examine them, one by one. You sleep with this understanding pressed against you as closely as the rough blanket. And though the night is cold, and though the world beyond your hut is uncertain, you drift slowly into rest, carrying with you the quiet knowledge that enduring is its own kind of answer. In the stillness before dreams take you, just for a moment, you feel the weight of all the other peasants and all the other villages scattered across the land, each of them lying down in their own huts, on their own straw, listening to their own winds and their own worries. You are not aware of them as individuals, yet you sense that your life is not singular, that the way you push through hunger and cold and fear is part of something larger and unspoken that stretches farther than you will ever travel. This, too, is a way of coping. This sense that your struggle is not unique, that your quiet persistence is shared, that you move through the same patterns of work and rest that others have followed, and will follow long after your name is gone. With that thought, soft and heavy, you finally let go of the day, and the hut, and the thin porridge, and the fields, and you slip into sleep like someone wading carefully into dark, still water. In the days that follow, hunger does not vanish, and it does not grow dramatically worse. It simply remains, like a weather pattern that never quite clears. And you begin to notice the small ways you and everyone around you try to bend food, stretch it, persuade it to become more than it really is. In your world, coping with hunger is not a single act. It is a long, quiet craft made up of dozens of tiny decisions, each one too small to feel heroic, each one important enough that you cannot afford to get it wrong. It begins each morning with the bread, or what passes for bread, now that the better flour has long since been used up. Once, early in harvest time, there were loaves that smelled faintly sweet when they came out of the oven, steam rising from their cracked crusts, the inside still soft enough that tearing off a piece felt like pulling apart something living. Those days were never plentiful, but they existed. And even if the bread was dark and heavy with rye and barley, instead of the fine white wheat you have heard about but almost never seen, it still had weight. It still sat solid and satisfying in your hands. Now, as winter leans further in, the bread has become something else. A thinner, tougher thing that shows in its own body how much you have asked of it. You find the loaf wrapped in a cloth, set carefully on a wooden shelf where the drafts are a little weaker, and you can tell by looking at it that it is older than your body would prefer. The crust has gone very hard, almost stone-like at the edges, and when you press your thumb against it, it barely dents. You carry it to the table anyway, because this is what you have, and you set it down with more care than its appearance would seem to deserve. The knife you use is dull but familiar, its handle polished by your fingers over years, and you take a moment to look at the bread from all sides, judging where it is thickest, where you can cut and still make it look like enough. You do not cut slices, not truly, not even pieces. You cut illusions. You angle the blade so that each portion is long and thin, a sliver rather than a slice, wide at one end and narrowing at the other, so that your eyes pick up the longer line and are tricked for a brief second into thinking there is more there. You do this slowly, not because you enjoy the process, but because every stroke of the knife is a decision, and you must decide again and again whether to give more to the child whose ribs you can count or to the older one who will be working in the fields all day, whether to keep something aside for the evening or commit to the present and hope that you or someone else will find something later. When the bread is portioned, you lay the pieces out on the table, the rough wood scarred by years of use, and for a moment you simply look at them, as if staring might somehow coax them into multiplying. The others gather quietly, their eyes drawn to the bread the way flowers turn to the sun, not with excitement, but with a steady, resigned need, and you begin to hand out the pieces. For the smallest, you do something you watched your parents do before you. You take the thin bread and dip it very briefly into a bowl of watered-down soup left from last night, just enough to soften it a little, just enough to add a hint of flavor and warmth, and you place it into his hands, as if it were something generous. Your own piece you do not eat all at once. You have learned long ago that your body handles hunger better when you feed it slowly, when you make each bite take up more time than its small mass would suggest. So you break your portion into even smaller bits, and you place them in your mouth, one by one, chewing carefully, letting your tongue press the bread against the roof of your mouth to squeeze out every taste of grain and salt, every memory of the field where the grain grew. You sip water between bites, partly to help the dry bread slide down, partly to fill the space left by the food that is not there. And in doing this, you teach your own body to accept being half satisfied as something close enough. When the bread is gone and the bowls are empty, you clean them in ways that do not waste, wiping the last crumbs into your hand, licking your fingers, scraping the sides of the pot with a piece of crust if there is any crust left to use that way. Humus has taught you that nothing is small enough to ignore. A smear of cooled fat, a few grains stuck to the wood, a sliver of root that sank to the bottom of the broth. All of these are parts of meals in a world where meals must be assembled from fragments. You rinse the bowls with a small amount of water, swirling it so that any remaining bits of food are lifted. And then you drink that water yourself, surprised to find that even this, even the faint taste of yesterday's soup, feels like something. Food is stretched not only by cutting it thin and eating it slowly, but by making it share the work with other things that are abundant, or at least less scarce. Water, time, roots, whatever the land and the edges of the land will still offer you. After the morning's small ration, you take a sack and a dull knife, and you head toward the fields that belong to the Lord, but are also, in a different way, yours, because you have worked them and walked them and watched them through every season you can remember. The harvest is long past, the grain already taken and measured and stored. But the earth never gives up everything. There are always leftovers, missed stalks, fallen heads, grains hidden in the rough stubble, waiting for eyes and hands patient enough to find them. Gleaning is what you do now. With your back bent and your eyes close to the ground, you move slowly through the stripped fields, searching for anything that might have escaped the sweep of the scythes and the gathering hands weeks ago. You know the rules. Officially, this is tolerated, even allowed. A kind of thin charity that costs the Lord little but means much to those who have so little. Unofficially, you know there are limits you are not meant to cross. Invisible lines beyond which your picking is no longer seen as gleaning, but as stealing. So you move with care, always aware of how heavy your sack is, always aware of who might be watching, always aware of how much hope you let yourself feel. The earth is hard, the stubble rough and sharp against your fingers. And often what you find is barely worth the effort. A few loose kernels, a small torn head of grain half rotted by the damp. Still, you gather them, because hunger has taught you to respect small numbers, to understand that a handful of almost nothing can, over days and weeks, add up to something. You tip each new find into your sack, the soft tap of the grains against the cloth sounding louder in your imagination than it does in reality. And you keep going, step by slow step, bent in a posture that makes your back ache, but let your eyes see what they need to see. Beyond the fields, where the controlled lines of plowed land give way to the looser, wilder shapes of hedges and rough ground, another part of your work begins. Here the earth offers different kinds of food, things that do not belong to anyone in the same way the grain does. Or, if they do, their ownership is looser, defined more by who knows where to look and what to pick. Roots are what you seek now. Roots and herbs and anything else that can go into the pot and make the thin, grain-based meals feel a little less empty. You kneel by the edge of a small stream where wild plants grow in tangled clumps, their leaves browned by frost, but their lives not quite gone. And you begin to dig. Your knife is poor at this work, but your hands are better. And soon enough your fingers are in the cold soil, pushing aside stones and clumps of earth, feeling for the shape of something that might become food. You seek out familiar forms, the long, pale bodies of certain roots that, when scrubbed and boiled, yield a faintly sweet, earthy taste. The knobbier, stronger smelling roots that are bitter on their own, but lend depth to a soup. Even the thin, stringy roots that give more illusion than substance, but still have a place in your pot. You pull them free one by one, the soil clinging to their sides, and lay them in your sack next to the small amount of grain you gleaned earlier, watching as the contents become more varied, more like the beginning of a meal, and less like a symbol of need. There is danger here, too. Not the sharp danger of soldiers or the clear danger of a failing harvest, but the quieter danger of ignorance and exhaustion. The land offers plants that feed, but also plants that harm. And when you are tired, when your stomach is loud, when the days blur together, it is possible to make mistakes. You remember stories whispered at night of children who ate the wrong berries, of families sickened by roots that looked right, but were not. So you move with caution, repeating in your mind the lessons taught to you by those who came before. This leaf shape is safe. That one burns the tongue. This smell is reassuring. That one means trouble. This plant grows here. That one only over there. Coping with hunger means never letting hunger hurry you too much, even when everything in you urges you to grab and swallow. Sometimes, on days when the cold is a little less sharp and your energy stretches further than you expect, you venture beyond the hedgerows into the wood. Not deep, never deep, just far enough to reach the places where small creatures and wild plants might add their modest weight to your food stores. You look for fallen branches that can become fuel first, because without fire there is no point in finding other things, and you stack them in your arms or tie them into a bundle with an old strap, knowing that the warmth they will provide is as much a part of the meal as anything you might cook over them. Among the leaves you sometimes find nuts, overlooked by animals. Their shells damp, but their insides still good. And you pick them up, one after another, feeling their reassuring solidity in your palm. On rare days, a rabbit might cross your path, a flash of fur and sudden motion at the edge of your vision, and your whole body will tense with a hunger that is almost painful. You do not often catch such animals. You lack the tools, the time, the strength to run after them, and the forest is large enough to hide them well.
But sometimes you come across a snare someone else set and abandoned.
Or you see a bird that has crashed against a branch and lies stunned. And in those moments, hunger makes your decisions for you as much as your mind does. You take what you find, quickly, almost guiltily, because you know that meat is not meant for people like you, except on the rarest occasions. And yet, here it is, suddenly part of your world. Later, you will stretch it too, boiling it into a broth so thin that the meat itself is tasted more than eaten. The flavors spread across many mouths and many evenings. Back at the hut, your gleaned grains, your gathered roots, your few nuts or scraps of meat join the small stores already in place. And this is where another kind of stretching begins. The kind that happens inside the pot. You have learned through repetition and careful observation how to make water and time into ingredients alongside food. You have learned that if you simmer something slowly enough, if you let the flavors seep out into the liquid for long hours, then even a small piece of root or a handful of grain can give the sense of a meal larger than it is. So you chop, you scrub, you peel with your knife or your thumbnail, and you drop each piece into the pot with a kind of muted reverence, knowing exactly how much went into acquiring it.
The soup or stew that results is rarely thick.
You watch as the water comes to a boil, as the bubbles rise and break, as the thin film of fat, if there is any, spreads itself across the surface in a faint sheen. You stir slowly, feeling the resistance of the liquid against your spoon, the small bumps of root and grain, the way everything moves together in a circle. You add pinches of salt when you have it, herbs from small bundles you dried months ago when the world was green and generous, their leaves now brown and fragile, but still capable of releasing a trace of their old scent. You know that these touches do not add much in terms of weight, but they add something else. A reminder that food can, in some sliver of memory, also be pleasure. When the time comes to eat, you perform again the careful rituals of distribution. But now the portions are deeper, if not richer, and you can at least fill the bowls close to the rim. You know that most of what fills them is water, yet the sight of a full bowl does something to the mind that an empty one cannot. You watch as the children blow on the surface to cool it, their breath making small ripples, as they scoop up the thin broth with their spoons, chasing the pieces of root or grain that drift through it, as their faces relax just a little with each swallow. You eat too, but you remain half aware of how many solid pieces end up in which bowls, how many nights you can repeat this before your gathered stores vanish again. Stretching food also means stretching the idea of what counts as food. You have eaten things in recent years that your younger self would have turned away from with a wrinkled nose. But hunger has a way of teaching gratitude where there was once only preference. You have learned that the tough outer leaves of certain plants, if boiled long enough, soften into something chewable. That bones, even when stripped of meat, still hold value, their marrow and minerals seeping into broth if you are patient. That the heel of a loaf, dried and nearly inedible on its own, becomes a treasure when dropped into a pot and allowed to drink in liquid and flavor. Many of your meals now are built around such transformations, small alchemies that turn waste into sustenance. There are moments when you catch yourself remembering stories told in childhood, tales of tables heavy with roasted meats and white bread, of cups overflowing with wine, of banquets that last all night. Those stories were meant to describe the lives of lords and kings or the feasts of saints in heaven, and they always sounded more like magic than anything that could exist in your world. Now, when hunger presses a little more insistently than usual, you find that you do not yearn for those impossible scenes. They are too far removed from the shape of your days. Instead, your fantasies are modest. A pot full of thick stew where the spoon stands upright without effort. A loaf of bread soft enough to tear without straining your fingers. A piece of cheese as large as your hand. These are the images that visit you when you close your eyes at night. And in some strange way, Accepting their smallness is also a way of coping. You are not alone in this craft of stretching. Everyone in the village plays their part in it, each household learning its own variations on the same theme. You see neighbors adding more water to their pots each week. You hear them speak in low tones about how they mixed ground acorns into their flour, or boiled nettles like cabbage when cabbage was gone. Sometimes, in a gesture that feels almost extravagant, people share ideas the way others share recipes in richer places, comparing notes on which herbs make thin gruel taste less bland, on how long to soak old beans to coax them into softness, on how to dry slices of root by the fire so they will keep a little longer. These are conversations born from scarcity, but they contain a kind of quiet intelligence, a recognition that survival is something you can learn and refine. There are also the moments when the demands placed upon you by those above make the act of stretching feel like a test designed to break you. A messenger from the manor might arrive to collect a portion of grain for some levy you barely understand, a portion that would have meant several days of not hungry but not full for your family. You watch as measurements are taken, as sacks are weighed, as the grain you have worked so hard to coax from unkind soil is loaded onto carts and carried away. In those moments, coping with hunger becomes indistinguishable from coping with anger and powerlessness. And when you return to your hut and look at the smaller pile left behind, it takes effort not to see each missing handful as a stolen heartbeat. Yet even then, you force yourself back into the craft. You look at what remains, you assess, you adjust. Perhaps you decide that soup will be thinner this week, that bread will be cut even more carefully, that roots will need to take up more space in the pot. Perhaps you choose to skip a portion yourself, to drink hot water flavored with a shred of herb instead of eating. And you tell yourself that your body can handle it, that you are older and stronger, that the children must come first. You do not declare these things out loud. You simply live them. And in living them, you quietly weave another thread into the rough fabric of your resilience. Coping, you begin to realize, is not something you do once and then have done forever. It is a series of small agreements you make with yourself each day. To accept that this piece of bread will be thinner than yesterday's. To accept that roots and herbs must stand in for meat. To accept that water will often fill your stomach more than food does. To accept that anger and grief over this will not change the fact that you must rise tomorrow and do it all again. These agreements are not joyful, but they are necessary. And the more you make them, the more they become part of who you are, as familiar as the weight of your cloak on your shoulders or the feel of the spoon in your hand. At night, when the day's gleaning and gathering is over and the pot has been scraped clean, you lie down on the straw and let your thoughts move backward through the hours. You see your own hands cutting the bread, your own fingers digging in the cold earth, your own shadow bent over the fields. You think of how many small acts it took to create the modest warmth you felt in your stomach at midday, and how quickly that warmth faded, leaving only the memory. And yet, you are still here. Your heart still beats. Your lungs still draw in the cold air. Your muscles still lift and carry and work. In a world where hunger just is, constant and unremarkable, this ongoing existence is not something that anyone will praise you for. But in the quiet of the hut, with the fire burning low, you can recognize it yourself as a kind of quiet, stubborn victory. You do not know what the next weeks will bring, whether the winter will turn harsher, whether the grain stores will hold, whether rumors of distant trouble will move closer. What you do know is what you will do tomorrow morning. You will rise in the cold before the sun. You will look again at the bread. You will measure again the grain. You will judge again the roots and herbs, and you will repeat all the small, careful movements that turn not enough into something that carries you one more day. This is how medieval peasants cope with hunger. Not in grand gestures, but in the repeated, almost invisible art of stretching every crumb, every root, every moment of warmth as far as it will go. And as you close your eyes, letting sleep slowly pull you down, You feel that art living in your bones, as much a part of you as the hunger it answers. The war does not arrive all at once. It comes first as a word, as a faint disturbance carried in someone's mouth from a place you have never seen, and it drifts into your village like cold air seeping under a door, invisible and impossible to push back out. You're still busy coping with hunger and the threat of harsh winters, still measuring bread and stirring thin soup and stacking wood against the cold. But now there is a new presence in the background of your days, something that does not feed you or warm you, something that only takes up space in your mind. It begins on an ordinary evening when your body is tired in the usual way, and your stomach is empty in the usual way, and the fire in your hut is burned down to a gentle, familiar glow. You are sitting close to the hearth, working on a simple repair, mending a strap, checking the haft of a tool, letting your hands move through these motions they know so well. Outside, the sky is already dark, and the sounds of the village have softened. But there are still occasional footsteps on the path, still the murmur of late voices carried by the cold air. When the door opens and a gust of that air pushes into the hut along with a figure wrapped in travel-stained clothes, you look up with a kind of curiosity that is mostly habit, expecting nothing more than the usual, a neighbor, a relative, someone you have seen 100 times before. Instead, you see a man who is not from here. You know this at a glance, from the way his cloak hangs differently, from the shape of his boots, from the unfamiliar cut of his beard, from the way he carries himself as if he has walked a long way and expects to walk longer still. He is not a lord, not a knight, just a traveler. But in your world, a traveler is a kind of moving news, a bundle of stories wrapped in worn cloth and dust. You do not speak much. Guests are rare and precious, and words are used sparingly, as food is. Yet as he settles near the fire in the center of the village, as others drift closer to hear, you find yourself standing just within earshot, your hands still, your eyes focused on a knot of wood, your ears wide open. That is when you hear it first, the word that will become part of your days. War. He does not say it loudly. It is just one word among many, dropped into his story like a stone into water. But you feel the ripples of it as clearly as if someone had thrown it at your chest. He speaks of disputes between men of rank, of border quarrels, of armies gathering far away. He describes banners you have never seen, colors and symbols that mean nothing to you, and yet you understand the shape of what he is saying. Soldiers moving, crops trampled, villages burned, people like you caught in the middle of conflicts that do not belong to them. There are details you do not fully grasp, names that fade as soon as you hear them. But some images remain. Smoke rising in the distance where a field should be. Carts loaded with grain taken from hands as rough and calloused as yours. At first, the news feels distant. The places he names exist only in your mind as vague directions. To the south, beyond the river, near the great town. You cannot imagine the roads there, cannot picture the lands between, and so it is easy in the first moments to tuck this word war into a corner of your mind and tell yourself it belongs to somewhere else. You go back to your work that evening with your fingers moving steadily, your thoughts returning to more immediate concerns. Tomorrow's tasks, the level in the grain sack, the child who has been coughing more lately. Still, as you lie on the straw that night with the familiar cold pressing down on you, the word floats up again, weightless and persistent. And you find yourself listening to the wind as if it might carry the sound of distant marching feet. In the days that follow, life does not change in any visible way. You still rise in the dark, still wrap yourself in your cloak, still walk the same path to the fields, still work the same earth under the same pale sky. Hunger continues its usual work inside you, making you careful and slow, teaching you how to pace your energy, how to stretch your strength as you stretch your food. The winter continues its slow approach, the air sharpening with each passing morning, the frost lying a little longer on the ground before the weak sun lifts it. Yet between these familiar patterns, small new lines are beginning to draw themselves. You hear them in the way your neighbors talk, in the way they pause a heartbeat longer before answering certain questions, in the way their eyes drift now and then toward the road rather than the sky. Rumors grow like ivy along the walls of your days, creeping up from the ground without anyone quite sure where the first tendril began. One person says that the traveler spoke of soldiers moving north. Another insists he said east. Someone mentions that a cousin in a neighboring village saw a band of armed men ride past, their armor dull in the weak winter light, their faces hard and unreadable.
Another voice claims that the Lord Steward has been seen at the manor more often than usual, going in and out of doors you have never passed through, carrying documents, his brow furrowed. None of these things on their own would change the shape of your life, but together they create a steady whisper that hums beneath everything else, like the low murmur of a river under ice. You cope with this new presence, this whispered war, much as you cope with hunger and cold, by folding it into your routines, by giving it a place to sit in the corner of your mind, without letting it take the whole room. On the mornings when you walk past the church, you find your eyes sliding up toward the squat stone tower, wondering if its bell will one day ring for something other than the usual, the call to prayer, the marking of a death, the celebration of a rare feast day. Inside the church, when you stand in the dim light filtered through small, uneven windows, you notice the priest's voice growing more insistent when he speaks of trials and suffering, of tests sent by God, of the need to endure with patience and faith. You wonder whether he has heard more than you have, whether news travels faster along stone corridors than along muddy roads. The fear that begins to gather in you is not a loud, sharp thing. It is not the immediate terror of a swinging blade or a sudden fire. It is slower, heavier, like a weight added quietly to something you already carry. You are already anxious about how long the food will last, about how cruel the winter winds will become, about sickness and accident. Now you add to that the imagination of other dangers, soldiers taking what little you have, battles turning fields into wasteland, orders to leave your home and go somewhere else that is not ready for you. At first, the images you conjure are clumsy and blurry, based more on stories and murmured tales than on anything you have personally seen. You imagine helmets and swords the way children imagine monsters, giving them exaggerated shapes and sizes. As more travelers pass through, the stories gain sharper edges. One speaks of a village where the men were summoned to fight, leaving behind women and children to manage the land as best they could. Another speaks of a town that had to provide carts and oxen to move supplies for an army, and when the animals were exhausted, they were taken as meat instead. You listen to these accounts with the same stillness you bring to all your listening, storing each detail like you store grain, knowing that not all of it is pure, that there may be stones among the kernels, exaggerations and misunderstandings. Yet enough of it rings true that you cannot dismiss it entirely. The talk of war is no longer a single word dropped by a single traveler. It is a thread woven now into many stories, crossing and recrossing the same dark pattern. Your coping takes on another form. You measure not just your food, but your reactions. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent, when to ask questions and when to let rumors pass without your voice adding to them. You notice that there are those in the village who thrive on the telling, who repeat every fragment of news with wide eyes and quick tongues, their fear wrapped in performance. You also notice those who shut down, who turn away whenever the subject arises, their lips pressed into thin lines as if holding back words they do not trust themselves to say. You place yourself somewhere in between, listening more than you talk, allowing the information to filter through you slowly, like water through cloth, catching what seems solid, letting the rest drip away. The Lord's presence, which was always a distant fact in your life, begins to feel more immediate now. Not because you see him, but because you feel his needs reaching toward you. One morning, men from the manor come to the village with written orders and stern expressions, and you are told that more grain will be needed, that additional levies must be prepared. The reason given is vague: support for a cause, loyalty to a crown, the defense of land you will never touch. But the effect is clear. What was already scarce for you must be made scarcer still. You stand in the cold as the steward speaks, his words rolling out in a rhythmic, practiced way, and you feel the collective tightening of the people around you, an invisible contraction as everyone thinks of their sacks, their bins, the corners where they have hidden extra handfuls. There is no open protest. The world you inhabit does not encourage such things. There are only small, quiet signs of resistance, small calculations made in tired minds. Which hiding places are safe enough not to be discovered? Which family members can be persuaded to eat a little less? Which possessions might be traded in secret later for food if the official stores run dry? Coping with the rumor of war, with the early tremors of its demands, means adjusting again to a reality that offers even less security than before. You find yourself rechecking your winter preparations, not just for cold and hunger, but for the possibility that other hands will reach for what you have stacked and stored. The woodpile takes on a new significance, not just as fuel, but as something that might need to be guarded. Despite all this, your days remain long and full. The fields still require attention. The animals still need care. Tools still break and must be mended. Time does not pause for fear. When you walk out into the weak midday light, the earth still presses up against your boots, solid and indifferent to human worries. You take some comfort in that, in the way the soil remains what it is, asking for your labor and offering its grudging yield in return, regardless of who wears the crown or how many soldiers tramp past on distant roads. The regularity of your tasks becomes a kind of shield. While your hands are busy with work you have done your whole life, the vague shape of war can hover at the edge of your vision without completely filling it. In the evenings, when the day's labor is done and it is too dark to do more outside, the village gathers in small clusters near hearths. Sometimes you sit in your own hut. Sometimes you find yourself drawn to a neighbor's fire. The allure not only of warmth, but of company. There is comfort in hearing other people breathe, in watching their faces in the shifting light, in listening to their voices rise and fall. Stories are told as they always have been. Tales of saints and miracles, of clever peasants outwitting devils, of animals that speak, of seasons that turned unexpectedly generous. Yet now, woven among these familiar tales, there are newer stories too. Pieces of news dressed in the clothing of narrative, making the war feel at once more real and more distant, depending on how they are told. You notice that in these gatherings, people cope not by ignoring the subject of war, but by turning it into something that can be held for a little while, then set down. Someone will recount a rumor, and for a few minutes everyone leans forward, caught in the gravity of it. Questions pressing quietly at the edges. How close? How many men? Which road? Then, when the story ends and there is nothing more to add, there is a small silence, a shared pause, and after it someone begins a different tale, one about a foolish fox or a saint who multiplied loaves, and the group allows itself to drift there instead. In this way, fear is acknowledged, but not allowed to reign. It is given time, and then it is gently but firmly moved aside to make room for other things. You add your own small gestures to this communal coping. On some nights, you choose to sit close to the children, letting their presence anchor you. You watch the way their eyes widen at mention of knights and battles, their fascination not yet tempered by the understanding of what such things mean for people like you. You answer their questions carefully, shaping your responses to give them enough truth to satisfy without enough detail to haunt their sleep. You speak of war in the language you know. More taxes, more work, less food. Danger on the roads. You leave out the sharper edges, not because you are lying, but because you know they will learn those parts soon enough. The church, too, becomes a place where fear is held in a certain way. When you stand in the cold nave during a service, the air smelling of wax and stone and damp wool, you listen to the priest speak of duty and faith with new attention.
He quotes words you have heard many times before about enduring trials, about the fleeting nature of earthly suffering compared to heavenly reward. But now, those words sink into you differently. You do not fully understand all the scriptures he refers to. Do not picture the distant lands where the stories took place. But you grasp the core of what he is offering. A way to see your difficulties as part of something larger and meaningful, rather than as random cruelty. Whether you believe this deeply or only partially, it gives your mind something to hold on to when the rumors crawl too close. Sometimes, despite all your efforts, fear arrives in the middle of the night, when the hut is dark and the fire is burned down to embers, and the sounds from outside are few and far between. You wake from a shallow sleep, with your heart beating faster than it should, your thoughts jumping ahead to images of armored men at your door, of flames licking at the thatch of your roof, of the grain you worked so hard to gather being loaded onto an unfamiliar cart. The darkness presses around you, and for a moment it is easy to believe that all of these imaginings are already on their way, just beyond the edge of your hearing. In those moments, coping means doing very small, very human things. Reaching out to feel the warmth of another body sleeping beside you. Focusing on the familiar rhythm of their breathing. Counting each inhale and exhale until your own breath falls into step with it. You remind yourself, quietly, that not every rumor comes true. That the world does not shift overnight just because words have changed in the air. You think about how many winters you have already lived through. How many seasons of worry you have already survived. And you let that history weigh more heavily than the uncertain future. You remember that for people like you, war is often something that passes close enough to be felt. To take something, to leave scars. But not always something that occupies every waking moment. Your life, you realize, is not defined only by what you fear might happen. It is also defined by what you do, day after day, in the worn circle of your world. So you rise each morning still. You dress in the cold, you tend the fire, you portion the food, you walk the familiar paths. You listen for news without chasing it. You try to keep your eyes open and your panic closed. You help your neighbors when their worry shows in the slump of their shoulders or the tightness of their mouths. Sometimes with a handful of grain, sometimes with a shared task, sometimes with nothing more than a quiet presence beside them in the field or by the hearth. In this way, the village learns to carry the rumor of war as it carries hunger and winter. Together, shoulder to shoulder, no one alone bending under the full weight. Coping with the whispers of fear does not mean you stop being afraid. It means you accept that fear will walk with you for a time, like a shadow, and you continue walking anyway. It means you let the rumors inform your caution, but not consume your hope. It means you keep making the same small, sensible choices, storing what you can, hiding what you must, supporting those around you, not because you are sure they will save you, but because they are the only choices you have. This is how a medieval peasant like you deals with the distant thunder of war. Not with grand speeches or bold defiance, but with steady, ordinary persistence, with ears open and hands still working the soil that tomorrow's food must grow from, no matter what banners fly above it. And as another day fades into another long, cold night, you lie down once more in the straw. The murmur of war is still in the air, but not in every breath you take, and you let sleep come, slow and heavy, knowing that when dawn arrives, you will rise again to meet whatever news it brings. You always imagined that if war truly came, it would fall on you like a hammer, a single shattering moment that changed everything. But when it finally reaches your village, it arrives the way most things in your life do, slowly, in small pieces, tangled into an ordinary day that begins almost exactly like any other. You wake in the half-dark as you always do, with cold air on your face and the muffled weight of rough blankets over your shoulders. And your first thoughts are still about the same old things, how thin the soup was last night, whether the wood pile will last the week, whether the cough you heard from the straw in the corner will be better or worse this morning. For a while, the world holds to that quiet, familiar shape. You stir the coals into life, crouched by the hearth, breath misting in the chilly air as you blow very carefully, feeling the warmth bloom just enough to bite at your cheeks. You measure grain with the same practiced caution you have learned from hunger, counting handfuls not by number, but by the weight in your palm and the weeks in your head. You stretch the morning porridge with water, stir slowly. Watch the thin mixture swirl around the pot. Smell the faint hint of something that wants to be more than it is. The others wake and gather, bowls in hand, faces pale and tired. You eat with the same deliberate slowness as always, making each mouthful last, pretending for a few heartbeats that your stomach is satisfied. You do not know, in those first small moments, that this will be the day when the distant shape of war finally steps across the threshold of your life. After breakfast, you prepare for the fields, pulling on your cloak, your cap, your worn boots. Outside, the morning feels heavier somehow, the air still but expectant, as if the sky is holding something in. The frost on the ground is harder than yesterday, crunching softly under your feet as you walk toward your usual tasks. You notice that the clouds are hanging low, thick and dull, and there is a faint smell of smoke in the distance that does not seem to belong to any of the village hearths. You tuck that observation away in the same crowded place where you keep all your worries, because there is wood to chop and fences to check and tools to mend, and these are things you know how to do. You cope with unease in the same way you cope with hunger, by giving your hands something solid to hold. You're in the yard near your hut, splitting a small pile of logs into smaller pieces that will catch quickly in the fire. When you hear it, a sound that does not belong to your ordinary world. At first, it is only a faint vibration under all the familiar noises, the caw of distant crows, the bark of a dog, the low murmur of voices. But then it grows clearer, a dull, rhythmic pounding that your body recognizes even if your mind takes a moment longer. Hoofbeats. Not the slow plod of a single rider traveling alone, but many, coming together in an uneven, rolling drum that carries across the cold air. You straighten slowly, the axe still in your hand, and turn toward the road. You are not the only one. The door of a neighboring hut opens, and someone steps out, wiping their hands on their tunic. Further down the path, a woman pauses with a bucket half lifted from the well. Children stop their games, wooden toys dangling from numbed fingers, their faces turned toward the same point. The village, which is usually busy with small movements that blur together, seems to freeze for a heartbeat, the way a field does when the wind suddenly shifts. Then everything begins again, but the rhythm has changed. A shout cuts across the open space, short and urgent. "Inside!" Someone calls to the children, and the word is picked up by others, passed from mouth to mouth with increasing speed. Doors open wider and then close. Dogs are dragged by their collars or pushed behind gates. Half-finished tasks are abandoned. You feel your own heart pick up its pace to match the distant hoofbeats, and you set the axe down carefully as if stillness in your hands can make up for the noise that is approaching. There are no orders written for moments like this, no clear rules, only habits and stories, and what you have managed to gather from the quiet talk of elders. You move without needing to think much, your body guided by a mixture of fear and practice. You step back inside the hut, and your eyes go straight to the places you have been planning in your mind ever since the first rumors of war began to spread. The sack with your best grain is not by the hearth today. That would be foolish. Instead, you have a smaller, poorer-looking sack there, filled with grain mixed generously with chaff, something that looks like more than it is and tastes like less. The better sack is hidden where you hope searching eyes will not think to look, its weight making one of the floorboards slightly less hollow than the others. You check it quickly now, pressing your foot down just enough to feel the reassurance of that quiet, secret heaviness. The children are already inside, their eyes wide, sensing the change in the air, even if they do not fully understand it. You tell one of the older ones in a calm voice to sit with the younger, to keep them back from the door. And you add a small task to that instruction, tidying a pile of cloth, checking the pot, because you know that giving the hands something to do helps the mind hold itself together. Outside, the hoofbeats are louder. You can hear voices now, sharp and unfamiliar, words thrown back and forth in a tone that brooks no delay. Someone near the edge of the village calls out again, this time a single word you do not want to hear. "Soldiers!" You share a look with whoever is in the hut with you, family, neighbor, it does not matter. And in that look is the whole tangled knot of fear and resignation that people like you carry. There's no question of running. The world is too open, the roads too well known, your responsibilities too rooted in this patch of land. There is only the choice of how to stand still. You step back outside, not because you are brave, but because you know that being seen as calm and compliant can sometimes keep worse things from happening. You wrap your cloak tighter and walk toward the main path, along with other adults emerging in ones and twos from their huts. You all stand in a loose line or cluster, not quite organized, but drawn together by the same tension. From here you can see the road clearly. The horses appear around the bend first, dark shapes against the pale sky, their breath puffing in white clouds. There are more of them than you hoped, fewer than you feared. A band large enough to feel overwhelming to a village like yours, but small enough that you know they are only a fraction of something bigger moving behind them. The men on their backs wear pieces of metal that catch what little light there is and turn it into a dull glint. Their cloaks are heavier than yours, their boots newer, their faces shielded by helmets or hoods. They look, you think, in a distant corner of your mind, like the figures from the stories told by the fire, but stripped of all romance, left only with weight and noise and need. When they reach the village, they do not stop all at once. A few ride on, circling the outskirts, eyes scanning the fields, the hedges, the wood beyond. Others slow and dismount, their movements efficient, practiced. One man, clearly in command by the way the others glance at him, steps forward and looks over the gathered villagers as if counting bags of grain instead of people. His gaze passes over you and moves on. And you feel a small, strange relief in not being singled out, even as you know that your sameness is part of what allows them to do what they do. The commander speaks, not with the thundering declaration of a storybook general, but with the flat, brisk tone of someone who has given this speech many times before. He speaks of necessity, of duty, of for the realm, words that belong to a world above yours that you have never seen. What you hear more clearly are the practical parts. They need food, they need fodder, they need a place to rest a while, they need men who can be taken to fight. Each of these needs points like an invisible finger toward the same thing, the thin stores and thin bodies of your village. There is no attempt to ask. It is all stated as decided fact, as if the war itself had already signed for what is being taken. The Lord Steward is there too, standing slightly behind the soldiers, his face tight. You recognize him, the man who comes at harvest time to measure your grain, to calculate what portion goes up the hill to the manor. Today he looks different, less like someone doing a job and more like someone trying to stay small in front of a larger power. You realize dimly that he is coping too, in his own way, caught between what he must demand and what he knows you can barely afford to give. The first real tearing happens quietly. Soldiers are sent to inspect the granaries, the barns, the sheds. They move through your world with a careless familiarity that hurts more than any shouted insult. A few of them come toward your hut, their boots leaving deep marks in the frosted earth. You walk with them, because not walking with them would invite suspicion, because your presence might, in some small way, persuade them to see your household as less worth upsetting than another. Inside, their eyes sweep across the room, quick and professional. One gestures toward the sack by the hearth, and you lift it for him to feel. He grunts at its lightness, his expression showing neither sympathy nor anger, only calculation. He does not notice the uneven floorboard, or he notices and chooses to ignore it, because the visible supply will fill the measure requested for this hut, and he is too tired to look harder. You will never know which it is.
Either way, you feel a knot loosening slightly in your chest as he turns away. Not everyone is as lucky. From somewhere deeper in the village, you hear raised voices, a protest cut off by a sharp command. A woman cries out, a sound that is not theatrical but raw. The sound of someone watching food for her children being carried away in hands that will never hold those children. You do not rush toward the noise. You have learned that throwing yourself into such moments rarely changes what is happening and often makes it worse. You stand very still instead, feeling each sound like a strike on your own skin. Later, you will learn that one man tried to hold back a small sack of grain or a side of salted meat, something he considered too precious to surrender, and that a soldier struck him down with the flat of a blade, leaving a bruise or a cut that will take days to heal. This is what war looks like, you realize, when it walks through a place like yours. Not battles between shining knights on open fields, but a sack taken from a corner, a man knocked to the ground in front of his children, a woman standing in the cold with empty hands. Then comes the business of the animals. Horses must be fed, and the hay you stacked so carefully for your own small beasts is suddenly of interest to others. You watch as bundles are carried out of barns, as piles grow smaller and ragged. One soldier eyes your thin cow with a speculative look, and for a moment you feel a flare of panic that almost pushes you forward. If they take the cow, what milk will there be in the coming months? What strength will you have left to plow? The commander glances over, estimates the value of your animal with a single practiced look, and shakes his head slightly. Not worth the trouble. The breath you release feels like it has been held in your chest for weeks. You cope with each of these small losses the way you have learned to cope with hunger, by narrowing your focus. You do not allow yourself to dwell in that moment on what the missing grain will mean when the winter deepens, on how the reduced hay will leave your animals thinner, on how the bruise on your neighbor's face will ache in the cold. Instead, you concentrate on the next immediate step. Answer the question asked. Move where they tell you to move. Keep your voice level. Keep your hands open and visible. Survival, you understand keenly today, is partly an act of staying as unthreatening and as forgettable as possible, of becoming background in a scene where attention can be dangerous. Eventually, inevitably, the conversation turns to men. The commander announces that strong arms are needed, that the fight cannot be won without the support of loyal subjects, that each village must provide its share. Around you, the air seems to tighten again. You feel the subtle shift of bodies as men straighten or shrink, as eyes flick toward the ground or toward loved ones. Names are not written down in this place, not for people like you. Men are picked by sight and by guess. That one looks strong enough. That one has grown sons to help at home. That one owes something from a season past. Perhaps there is some method behind it. Perhaps it is just convenience. However it is done, the effect is the same. A few men are told to step forward. Some do so slowly, faces pale but set. Others hesitate, only to be nudged or shoved by the butt of a spear. You watch this with the same tight feeling in your chest that you had when the soldier's hand lingered on your cowl. You listen hard for your own name, or for some indication that you will be called. In those moments, your whole world narrows to the space between each word the commander speaks. Whether you are chosen or not, coping begins the same way, by acknowledging silently that any result will hurt. If you are taken, the fields at home will suffer. The already thin safety net of your family will fray further, and you will be thrown into a world of sharp metal and shouted orders that you do not understand. If you are left, others will go, and their absence will ripple through the village, increasing the burden on those who remain. In the end, your name is not spoken. You do not know whether this is a blessing
or a temporary reprieve, you stand as still as you can, fighting the urge to sag with relief, because drawing attention to your not going could be as dangerous as going itself. Later, you will find yourself carefully avoiding the eyes of the families whose sons, fathers, or brothers are led away, your own survival feeling heavier, more complicated than before. The soldiers remain in the village for a time that feels too long and too short all at once. They water their horses, eat food that was meant for other mouths, stamp their boots on your ground. They leave behind footprints and emptier barns, and a new layer of tiredness in everyone's faces. There is no great scene of departure. At some point, the commander simply judges that they have taken what they can take and gained what they came to gain, and the order is given to mount up. The men chosen to fight are gathered, hands bound loosely, or not at all, because where would they run to in any case? The villagers who remain stand and watch as the column reforms, as hooves churn the frozen road into churned mud. No one raises a hand to wave. When the last horse disappears around the curve of the road and the echo of their passing fades, the village is left in a peculiar silence. It is not the comforting silence of a normal winter afternoon, full of small, familiar sounds. It is a silence that follows something loud and unwelcome. A silence made up of held breaths and thoughts that have not yet found a way into words. You look around and see the changed landscape of your own world. The woodpile lower than it was this morning, the doors of barns hanging open, the uneven lines in the snow where carts and boots have passed. A chicken lies dead near a fence, neck twisted, perhaps killed for amusement or simply stepped on by a careless boot. Someone is already bending to pick it up. Waste is still waste, even today. Then, slowly, movement returns. A child begins to cry, not loudly, just a thin sound of confusion. Somewhere, someone slams a door harder than necessary. A dog barks. Your body remembers, before your mind commands it, that there are tasks to be done now, a different kind of work that must follow what has just happened. You begin with simple things. You close your own door properly. You check the hidden floorboard and find, with something like disbelief, that the sack of better grain is still there, untouched. You touch it with your hand as if to confirm that it is real, and a tiny fragment of gratitude flickers through your exhaustion. You move the poorer sack back into place, tidy the space around the hearth, pick up a wooden bowl that someone knocked to the floor. Outside, you see neighbors doing similar things on a larger scale. One family is restacking what remains of their hay with quiet determination. Another is sweeping the trampled yard with a bundle of twigs, erasing the marks of unfamiliar boots. At the corner of the village, a woman tends to the man who was struck, washing blood from his brow with careful, practiced hands. No one speaks grand words about rebuilding or resilience. They simply begin. Later in the day, when the first shock has worn down into a more familiar fatigue, people gather again near the hearths, smaller groups this time, drawn together by the need to measure what has been lost and to begin the long work of adjusting. You sit with them, your hands wrapped around a cup of hot water that stands in for tea. The talk is low and slow. Someone lists the men who have been taken. Someone else calculates out loud how much grain is gone, how many animals, how much hay. Plans are made without the word plan being used. This household will share what meat they can spare this week with that household whose stores were hit harder. This person will help that widow with the heaviest tasks until her son, if he survives, returns. You listen, you nod, you offer what you can. Coping with the arrival of war in your village does not look like a single heroic act. It looks like this. Sitting in the smoky half-light, adding your tired voice to the others, agreeing to do one more thing, to stretch what you have a little further, to watch someone else's children while they mend a roof beam broken by a soldier's careless boot. That night, when you finally lie down again on the straw, your body feels heavier than it has in a long time. The events of the day replay themselves in your mind in slow, looping images. The first distant sound of hoofbeats, the the flash of metal armor, the cold eyes of the commander, the sight of your neighbor's son being led away. The hunger that curls in your stomach is sharper than usual, because there is less food now and more worry to feed. The cold feels deeper, too, because you know that the wood you burn tonight cannot be easily replaced.
And yet, beneath all of that, there is a quiet, stubborn thread of something else. The knowledge that you are still here, that your hut still stands, that some of your hidden stores survived, that you and your neighbors have already begun the work of living with what has happened. You turn onto your side, pulling the blanket closer, listening to the night, as you always do. The wind has changed direction again. You can tell by the way it rattles the loose board near the roof. Somewhere a dog whines softly in its sleep. In the distance, if you listen very hard, you might imagine you hear the echo of hooves still. But you know they are far away now, moving toward some other place where war will reach next. For you, for this night, the task is simpler, if not easy. Rest enough to rise again. Think just far enough ahead to prepare tomorrow's thin meals. Hold your fear in a shape that lets you keep moving. This, you realize, is how a peasant copes when war finally arrives at the door. Not by stopping it, because you cannot, but by surviving it, by enduring the taking and then quietly rearranging what remains, by standing with others in the village to patch the holes it left behind. And as sleep slowly pulls you under, you understand that tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, you will continue this work, just as you have continued through hunger and winter, because there is no other way to live a life like yours. By the time winter truly settles over your village, the world feels smaller in every direction, as if the cold has tightened a belt around everything you know and is pulling slowly, patiently, with no hurry at all. The days shrink until they are just thin slices of pale light between long stretches of darkness. And you find yourself measuring time not by the sun's path across the sky, but by the way the fire in your hearth rises and falls, the way the woodpile drops, the way the frost deepens on the inside of the window instead of the outside. You wake now not to faint dawn, but to a darkness that still feels like night. Your eyes opening to a room that has no edges at first, only vague shapes and the dim glow of dying embers. The cold is the first clear thing, sharp and immediate, pressing against your face and creeping in under the ragged blanket, making your fingers curl instinctively toward your chest. Your breath appears in front of you in pale clouds that fade almost before you can see them. And when you shift on the straw, you hear the faint crunch of frozen stalks, as if even your bed has stiffened in the night. Around you, the others are only lumps of shadow at first, bundled shapes wrapped in every scrap of cloth and wool you own. You can tell who is who without needing to see their faces, by the way each one breathes, by the tiny sounds they make in their sleep, by the spots they occupy night after night. You lie still for a few moments longer than you used to when the weather was gentler, knowing that once you move, once you push aside the thin layer of warmth that your bodies have managed to store under the blankets, the cold will rush in faster, filling every space it can find. Still, the day does not begin without you, and in winter, the work of simply enduring is as real as any work in the fields. You sit up slowly, pulling the blanket tight around your shoulders for a moment before relinquishing it to those who still sleep, and your feet find the floor with a small jolt as your skin meets the icy, packed earth. The hut is so familiar that you can move through it half blind, and this is good, because the light is barely enough yet to outline the door, the hearth, the low table. You go first to the fire as you always do, dropping to your knees in front of the gray mound where last night's heat has hidden itself. With numb fingers, you push aside ashes, searching for the faintest glow, the quiet red eye of an ember that has refused to die. When you find it, your shoulders loosen a fraction. You will not have to start from nothing. You coax the ember carefully back toward life, adding a twist of dry straw, a fragment of kindling chosen for its thinness, its willingness to catch.
You bend close, your face almost in the ashes, and blow soft, measured breaths until a thin tongue of flame flickers up, wavers, then steadies. You feed it with more small pieces of wood, building the fire slowly so as not to drown it in its own fuel. And gradually the room begins to shift from formless darkness to a dim, smoky space lined with shadows that you recognize as walls, beams, tools, people. The warmth that reaches your skin is modest, hardly more than a suggestion. But after the harsh chill of the waking moment, it feels like an unexpected kindness. When you step outside to fetch more wood, the world meets you with a different kind of cold. Larger and cleaner, and far less forgiving. The sky is a flat, unbroken gray, the kind that gives you no hint of the sun's exact location, and the air feels dry enough to crack if you moved too quickly. Snow lies across the village in uneven layers, packed where feet have trodden, soft and untouched in corners that no one is needed to cross. Your boots crunch through the thin crust on top, and the sound seems too loud in the stillness, as if you are intruding on something that belongs solely to winter. The woodpile against the side of the hut is shorter than it was a week ago, shorter than it was yesterday, and you feel that difference in your chest, like a missing tooth in your mouth. You run your hand along the cut ends of the logs, counting without numbers, feeling the spaces where there used to be more. Every piece you take inside is both a blessing and a cost. It will warm the room for an hour or two, but it will not be there anymore tomorrow or the day after. You learn to make each log work as hard as you do, to place it carefully in the fire so that it burns slow and steady instead of fast and bright, to accept a lower, weaker flame if it means the wood will last longer. Back inside, the day begins in the same way it has for many weeks now, with the measured routine of coping. You prepare the morning meal, if it can be called that, a thin porridge of grain and water, perhaps thickened with a bit of root or a scrap of yesterday's bread, if there is any to spare. In winter, even more than before, you treat each mouthful as if it has to carry you across a great distance. You portion the food with the care of a scribe, copying holy words, placing bowls in front of each person, making sure the children's are not too empty, making sure everyone receives something, even if what you press to your own lips is mostly warmth and steam. You have learned that during the coldest months, hunger changes its shape. In autumn, it was a sharp, insistent thing that gnawed at you whenever you paused long enough to notice. Now it is quieter, heavier, a constant dull ache that sits behind your ribs like a stone. Your body has accepted, in its own reluctant way, that fullness is no longer an option, only degrees of emptiness. Coping means teaching yourself to be content with the smaller degrees, to recognize that there is a difference between the kind of hunger that lets you work and the kind that makes your hands shake too much to hold an axe. The work outside is different now, too. The fields are sleeping under their layer of snow and ice, the soil hard as iron. There is no plowing, no sowing, none of the frantic movement that fills the days of other seasons. Winter tasks are quieter, more about maintenance than progress. You check the fences, not because anything will grow beyond them right now, but because a broken section of hedge might invite wolves or desperate men closer. You inspect the thatch on the roof, clearing away 2 heavy clumps of snow before they pull the straw loose. You tend to the animals, whose bodies are like small, moving hearths, giving off heat into the cold air. You move between hut and barn, between barn and the little yard, your breath a constant ghost in front of you. The cow's breath clouds around her muzzle as she stands in her cramped shelter, ribs showing more clearly each week as the haystack shrinks. You run a hand along her flank, feeling the roughness of her winter coat, murmuring without words. Her health is not just her own. It is milk in the pail, strength in the plow, life in the muscled curve of her body. You measure the hay the way you measure everything now, always holding back a fraction for the future. always worrying that your careful fractions will still not be enough.
On some days, you go to the forest edge or along the frozen stream to gather what can still be gathered. Fallen branches, dead wood, anything that will burn. You scan the bare branches of trees for the dark shapes of birds you might one day catch, for the strange white growths of winter fungi you've been told are safe, for any sign that the land is still willing to offer you something. The world feels stripped down to its bones, and you move through it like someone walking through a house that has been emptied of furniture, searching corners for forgotten scraps. The silence is thick, broken only by the creak of tree limbs in the cold and the distant call of a crow. Inside the hut, the hours of daylight are short and often filled with tasks that do not require much space but demand patience. Clothes wear out faster in winter, rubbed thin at the elbows and knees, torn more easily by stiff, frozen fabric. You spend long portions of the day mending tunics, darning socks, reinforcing seams with whatever thread you have.